Day 745, Tuesday, November 25th. Matthew 3:7-10 and Luke 3:7-14. Matthew 3:7-10 NKJV. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, "Brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore bear fruits worthy of repentance, and do not think to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I say to you that God is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones. And even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Therefore every tree which does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." Luke 3:7-14 NKJV. Then he said to the multitudes that came out to be baptized by him, "Brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore bear fruits worthy of repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I say to you that God is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones. And even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Therefore every tree which does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." So the people asked him, saying, "What shall we do then?" He answered and said to them, "He who has 2 tunics, let him give to him who has none, and he who has food, let him do likewise." Then tax collectors also came to be baptized, and said to him, "Teacher, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Collect no more than what is appointed for you." Likewise the soldiers asked him, saying, "And what shall we do?" So he said to them, "Do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages." Daily Deep Dive, Matthew 3:7. We've already covered the Pharisees and Sadducees in our first day of introduction to the New Testament. John calls both of these groups in a general sense a brood of vipers, NKJV. The word translated brood simply means things produced. Jesus uses this to refer to fruit of the vine, Matthew 2:6-29, Luke 22:18. When referring to mankind or animals, the idea would be offspring. In a figurative sense, it carried the idea of passing down of the character of someone. It's this figurative sense that John is using. So what was the nature or character they had, and who were they offspring of? John uses a word translated into NKJV as vipers. The Greek echidnon ekiotodelta. This word in the Greek culture had 3 main meanings. 1 was simply for a venomous snake, not just snake, but venomous. 2, the echidna was in classic Greek mythology a primordial monster existing from the beginning of time. She was half woman and half snake. This being was often referred to as the mother of monsters, fearsome one, and the root of serpents. In mythology she gave birth to many of the most infamous beasts, including Cerberus, 3-headed dog of Hades, Hydra, and Chimera. This mythic background of this Greek word gave it a double cultural meaning when applied to people of someone who was deadly, corrupt, or had a monstrous side. Greeks associated the term with treachery, hidden danger, sudden attack, cunning behavior. At the time John uses this word, it was among the strongest forms of public condemnation available. In my mind, this Greek mythology brings together imagery of the cunning serpent of Genesis 3, which Revelation 12:9 and 22 identifies as the devil and Satan, but also the Revelation 17 imagery of the woman riding the beast. In many ways these religious leaders of Jesus Christ's day were of the same Babylon, the great system that has spread through our entire world, down through time to today. What was this wrath to come that John said these individuals were trying to flee? The Jews would have understood this to mean God's wrath to come as connected with the day of the Lord. In Isaiah it states, Isaiah 13:9, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with both wrath and fierce anger to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it." Isaiah 13:11 "I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible." And Isaiah 13:13 "Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place, in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger." In Zephaniah 1:14-17 it states, "The great day of the Lord is near, it is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter, there the mighty men shall cry out. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers. I will bring distress upon men, and they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood shall be poured out like dust, and their flesh like refuse." These are just some of the scriptural references they would have known regarding God's wrath and the day of the Lord. Now the imagery used here is that these venomous snakes are fleeing the wrath. Scott Ashley has mentioned that fires occasionally break out in these Jordan Valley and Judean wilderness areas from lightning, and as the fires spread, out of all these rocks and cracks come slithering desert vipers trying to escape the flames. That's an interesting mental picture. Matthew 3:8. We spoke above about this idea of repentance. where individuals change their minds in such a way that they turn their whole life towards God. Here John adds that an individual should be bearing fruits that are worthy or befitting, congruous with repentance. Once someone begins to rethink their actions and choices, and wants to now live differently, their lives should be showing that they are now choosing to live differently. Compare Acts 26:20. Matthew 3:9. The Jews took a lot of pride that they were God's special people as descendants of Abraham. There is a well-recognized Aramaic wordplay that occurs in this verse. And while the Gospel was recorded for us in Koine Greek, this gives circumstantial evidence that John, and likely Jesus, is often taught in Aramaic. Now I've never studied Aramaic, so I'm taking the word of scholars who have. In Aramaic the word play appears in the sentence, God is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones. Aramaic for children, bini Aramaic for stones. Abni. These words differ by only a small consonantal shift and sound very similar. The pronunciation of these words are bene bene. The rhyme and consonant overlap would have made this memorable. And the message would have been clear. God doesn't need your pedigree. He can turn stones, abni, into sons bne if he wants to. Interestingly, the word play exists in the Hebrew of this also. Eben stone, equal to eben ben son equal to ebn. Rabbinic literature sometimes plays on ben eben in wordplay about sons and stones, suggesting this was already a known pun in Jewish sacred rhetoric. Matthew 3:10. Here John moves from his previous idea of bearing fruit worthy of repentance, and moves to a personal judgment of every tree that individually does not produce. Fruit is cut down and burned up. Jesus himself would echo this teaching in Matthew 7:19, Matthew 12:33, and Luke 13:6-9. Luke 3:7. Here Luke records multitudes that Matthew recorded as the Pharisees and Sadducees. Luke 3:10. Notice the response of the people. The crowd is to ask, "What shall we do then?" Essentially they ask, what are the works or fruits worthy of repentance that we should be doing, so we aren't chopped down? John answers this in verse 11. His answer shows a clear principle we see throughout the Bible that I want to take a moment here to discuss, because we'll continue to reference this often throughout the New Testament. Does God expect us to help everyone? Did Jesus Christ physically heal, feed, and do miracles for everyone? No. How do we please God and know how to help others? The principle shown throughout the Bible is when the person is in our sphere, our area of impact, and we have the means in which we can help, then God absolutely expects us to help. He never asks us to try to solve all the world's and all people's problems. But when we have what is necessary to help, whether money, time, resources, knowledge, etc., and people come into our circle, our knowledge awareness, God expects us to help. We'll continue to develop this throughout this reading plan. But here notice the first example is someone who doesn't have a covering garment, and they come to your attention and you have more than you absolutely need. You need one yourself, so you aren't told to give them the one you need, otherwise you are now in need. But you are told to give what you have that you can spare. In this case, that is the extra tunic covering garment. You might now be a bit colder and less comfortable, but you are both now in that place together versus you comfortable, and they are in need. Same here with the food. You become aware of someone who has no food, and you have more than you need to survive. God expects you to share. You may now be hungrier than you would otherwise have been. But you both survive, and you've helped the person in your circle out of what you had to give. Luke 3:12, then tax collectors come, and they too want practical help so they don't get cut down. In verse 13 John tells them to do their job as Rome ordered, collecting taxes. But don't extract more from people than that. In other words, be fair with people. Rome used a tax farming structure, where wealthy individuals would bid for the right to collect taxes. They would then pay Rome up front for the taxes that would be due, and then collect taxes from the people. Anything they collected above the amount, they kept as profit. This system built corruption into its structure. The more they squeezed from people, the more they earned. Rome rarely intervened. As long as the money kept coming in, tax collectors often charged more than the legal rate, invented various fees and processing costs, and claimed Rome had raised tax rates when they really had not. Additionally, as we see addressed throughout the Bible, they would cheat by manipulating scales and weights or manipulating records to show the individual had more grain, oil, etc. than was true. Travelers could face new made-up tolls for roads, bridges, markets, harbors, customs, or military protection. Tax collectors would often hire local muscle or soldiers to threaten, and in some cases beat or detain individuals until they paid more. There are even recordings of deals between bandits and tax collectors, where bandits would terrorize travelers and then tax collectors would get them to pay for protection, and then the two would split the profit. Lastly, tax collectors could lower taxes for friends and raise taxes for enemies. Due to all of this corruption, John simply told them to collect no more than they were appointed to collect. The job itself wasn't a problem, but they needed to be fair and just in collecting taxes. Luke 3:14, now soldiers come to John to ask what they should do to please God. These local soldiers were known for corruption and brutality. I use the word local soldiers because these were likely not the Roman soldiers legionnaires. Like tax collectors, these were likely local Jewish men who were part of the local law enforcement. They were under the control of the local rulers, governors, and administrators. Unlike Roman soldiers who were under the orders and direction of Rome, these were local soldiers, more similar to local police or deputies. This gave them access to the locals with very little oversight. When John responds, he uses the Greek muta delta nu alpha delta iota alpha sigma epsilon sigma eta tau epsilon, which literally means do not shake anyone down. The typical method of these shakedowns were to demand payment, threaten to beat or arrest them, threaten to report them as rebels, and to threaten to confiscate grain, oil, animals, etc. if they didn't make the payment demanded. John then used the Greek phrase, muta delta, sigma epsilon kappa macron phi alpha now sigma eta tau epsilon, which means do not extort through false charges. These local soldiers could bring false charges of tax evasion, incomplete papers, accusations of insurrection, or charging them for breaking some local regulation. Bribes for settling these false charges were a huge source of soldiers' incomes. It was also common for soldiers to demand food, firewood, the use of an animal to carry them or equipment, or for the person to carry their gear. Compare Matthew 5:41. They would sometimes seize someone's personal belongings under the pretext of governmental authority, such as confiscating someone's tools, animals, clothing, goods, etc. Sometimes they would promise to return it later, after the need for it was finished, but that never happened. Beatings by soldiers were common. It's true that soldiers made very little, even sometimes receiving partial or late wages themselves. These meager wages were ripe for breeding corruption. John the Baptizer's message is, be content with your meager wages and don't do wrong to others. John is clearly addressing issues that were common among tax collectors and these local soldiers.